She didn't cry when the auctioneer called her name for the third time, and no one raised a hand. Charlotte Bennett stood on that wooden platform with her chin up and her fists pressed flat against her skirt, staring out at a room full of people who had already decided she wasn't worth the price of a meal. She wasn't going to give them tears. She wasn't going to give them anything. But her hands were shaking, and one man in the back of the room saw it. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very last word, because this one doesn't end the way you think it will. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 came to Dust Creek, Montana, like a debt that had been building for years, heavy, punishing, and impossible to outrun. The town itself wasn't much to speak of. A single main street with a general store, a bank that held more men's futures than it had any right to a church. Nobody filled past halfway, and a saloon that stayed packed from noon to midnight, regardless of what day of the week God had assigned to rest. It was the kind of town where a man's worth was measured in acreage and cattle count, and a woman's worth was measured in something far more unkind. The bride auction had been running since morning. It wasn't called that officially. The flyer nailed to the post outside the saloon called it a settlement introduction event, a dignified phrase for a process that had about as much dignity as a livestock sale. Women who had traveled from the eastern states, some of them widows, some of them simply desperate for a different kind of life, were brought forward one at a time to stand on a raised wooden platform at the front of the saloon, while the men of Dust Creek looked them over and decided whether any of them were worth the price of a traveling fee and a marriage contract. Most of the women had been claimed by midday. The pretty ones went first, then the young ones, then the ones with family money mentioned in their introductions. By early afternoon, the platform had cleared out fast, and the crowd of men had thinned right along with it, satisfied customers drifting back out into the heat with their choices made and their futures temporarily settled. By 3 o'clock, there was only one woman left. Charlotte Bennett had been standing on that platform for the better part of an hour. She was 25 years old, with a round face that might have been called sweet in a different room, dark brown hair braided simply down her back, and blue eyes that had been carefully trained on a fixed point somewhere above the heads of the crowd for the last 40 minutes. She was also, by any measure, the town of Dust Creek chose to apply a large woman. Full-figured in a way that the frontier did not consider fashionable, heavy in the hips and shoulders, with strong hands that had spent years working in her father's general store back in Tennessee, before debt and loss had stripped that life away from her too. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. She'd been watching them see it all morning. The auctioneer, a thin man named Gerald Pruitt, who sweated through his collar even in the shade, cleared his throat for what felt like the 100th time, and tried again. Miss Charlotte Bennett, formerly of Nashville, Tennessee, 25 years of age, experienced in bookkeeping and domestic management, in good health. Someone in the crowd laughed. Not a small laugh. A laugh meant to be heard. "Good health," a voice called out from somewhere to the left. "That's one way to put it." More laughter. Pruitt's ears went red, but he kept his eyes on his paper. In good health, seeking honest employment, and a willing partner for frontier life. Starting bid is set at, "Who's bidding on that?" Another man said louder this time, making sure the whole room caught it. "She'd eat half the ranch before winter." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She did not look down. She did not look at whoever had said it. Her eyes stayed fixed on that invisible point above their heads, and her hands pressed harder against the fabric of her skirt, and she thought about her father, who had told her once that the only thing cruelty was ever actually about was the fear of the person doing it. She'd believed him then. She was working very hard to believe him now. "Come now, gentlemen," Pruitt said, with the strained cheerfulness of a man who wanted this concluded before supper. "Miss Bennett comes with a strong set of practical skills. Any ranch operation would benefit from, 'My dog benefits my ranch,'" a heavy-set man near the bar said, and got a fresh wave of laughter for it. "At least my dog don't eat as much." Charlotte breathed in slowly through her nose. She had not come this far, had not sold the last of her mother's good china, had not ridden 3 days in a cattle car, had not signed her name to a contract that reduced her circumstances to a paragraph on a flyer, to fall apart on a wooden stage in front of men who wouldn't know her worth if it walked up and introduced itself. But her hands were still shaking, because she understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with self-pity. Exactly what happened, and if no one chose her today, she would be returned. That was the word Pruitt had used in his preliminary remarks, delivered with the practiced delicacy of a man who said uncomfortable things for a living. Returned to the Eastern Placement Office, which meant back to a city where she had no home, no family left, and no prospects she hadn't already exhausted. Back to starting over with nothing. She had come here for a chance, just one chance, and the room was laughing. Going once, Pruitt said with a tone that suggested he already knew the outcome. For Miss Charlotte Bennett, going twice. $2. The voice came from the back of the room. It was not a loud voice. It was not the voice of a man trying to make a statement, or draw attention, or prove something to the crowd. It was quiet, flat, and utterly certain. The way a man speaks when he has made up his mind and does not particularly care what anyone else thinks about it. The laughter stopped. Charlotte's eyes moved for the first time in an hour. Howe was standing near the back wall, slightly apart from the other men, like someone who had come in late and hadn't bothered to find a better position. Tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from real work and not from showing off. Dark brown hair under a worn hat, a jaw shadowed with a few days' growth, and eyes. Even from this distance, she could see the eyes that were not looking at her, the way the rest of the room had been looking at her all afternoon. Howe wasn't assessing her. He was watching the crowd. Like a man who found what he was looking at considerably less impressive than the thing he'd just decided to interrupt. Pruitt blinked at him. "I'm sorry, did you say $2? The man repeated exactly as quietly as the first time. "That's what I said." "Sir, the standard traveling fee alone is—" "I know what the fee is." He reached into the front pocket of his vest and produced a small fold of bills. Charlotte could see from the platform that it was not a thick fold, and held it up without particular ceremony. $2 is what I have. You want it or not?" The room had gone very quiet. Pruitt looked at the money. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at the rest of the crowd, none of whom had made any move to counter. "Well," he said slowly, "the terms do allow for negotiation in extenuating." "Then we're done negotiating," the man said. He walked forward through the crowd, which parted for him, with the instinctive deference that very certain men tend to generate, and placed the bills on Pruitt's table without looking at anyone. Then he looked up at Charlotte. Not at her dress, not at her figure, not at the places the crowd had been pointing their laughter. At her face. "Ma'am," he said. Just that. A single word delivered with the particular weight of a man who meant it as an apology and a question and a greeting all at once. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped down from the platform. His name was Wyatt Dawson, and she learned the important facts about him in pieces over the course of the 3-hour wagon ride out to his property, because he was not a man who offered information readily. He drove the wagon with the focused economy of someone who had been doing it for years, and he answered her questions honestly and briefly, and he did not ask very many of hers in return, which she found she did not entirely mind. His ranch was called the Broken D. He had built it himself, started it from nothing 11 years ago, and it had been a reasonable operation for most of that time, until 3 years back, when a drought had taken most of his herd, a blight had taken most of his crops, and a loan he had taken against the property to survive. Both of those things had compounded into a debt that was now being held by the Dust Creek Savings and Trust. With the kind of patient, predatory confidence that banks reserve for properties they are fairly sure they will own eventually. "How much do you owe?" Charlotte asked. He glanced at her sideways. "That's a direct question." "I find direct questions save time." A pause. $412. She processed that. "What's the interest rate on the loan?" Another glance. Longer this time. 12%. Compounding monthly. Compounding monthly. "And what's your current income from the operation?" He was quiet for a moment. "Why do you want to know all this?" "Because—" Charlotte said with the patience of someone who had kept the books for a family business from the age of 14. "I want to understand what I'm walking into. Is that not reasonable?" He looked at her again, that same look assessing, but not unkind, like a man recalibrating an expectation. And then he turned back to the trail and said, "Current income's about $30 a month if the market holds. Cattle are down to 14 head. I've got a kitchen garden, but it's not producing like it should. And I've got a loan payment of $52 due in 6 weeks." Charlotte did the arithmetic in her head. It took approximately 4 seconds. "That's a problem," she said. "Yes, ma'am, it is. But it's not an unfixable problem." He didn't respond to that right away. She watched the side of his face, the muscle that worked briefly in his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with a tension that wasn't quite steady. "How old are you?" she asked. 38. "You built this ranch yourself at 27. "I did." "Then you already know how to build something from nothing," Charlotte said. "What you apparently need is someone who can tell you where the money is going wrong." He turned and looked at her fully, then for the first time since they'd left the saloon. "Most people," he said carefully, "who see this situation walk the other direction." "I was standing on an auction platform an hour ago," Charlotte said. "I don't have another direction." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the particular softening that happens to a person's face when they hear something true. He turned back to the trail. "We'll be there in about another hour," he said. The house was worse than she'd imagined. She had imagined it as modest, and it was but modest in the way of something that had once been more, and had been letting go piece by piece for longer than one good season could fix. The porch railing was down on one side. 2 windows had been patched with oilcloth instead of glass. The barn needed new roof boards in at least 3 visible places, and the kitchen garden she'd been promised was a row of sad, struggling plants that had clearly not been watered with any consistency. Charlotte stood in front of it with her single bag at her feet and looked at all of it. "It's not much," Wyatt said behind her. It wasn't an apology exactly, more of a plain statement of fact, delivered by a man who didn't believe in prettying up the truth. "No," she agreed. "It's not. If you want to, show me the account books," she said. He stopped. "What?" "Your financial records, whatever you have. Receipts, ledger pages, anything you've been keeping track of expenses with." She picked up her bag. "I'd like to look at them before supper." He stared at her for a moment that stretched long enough to become almost funny. "You want to look at my account books," he said. "Unless you'd rather I just unpack first and ask later. But the loan payment is in 6 weeks. Mr. Dawson, and wasted time doesn't tend to improve a balance sheet." Another long look. Then he walked past her to the front door, pulled it open and said, "Books are in the desk, 2nd drawer on the left. I'll put on coffee." The books were a disaster. Not a dishonest disaster that she could see immediately. Wyatt Dawson was clearly a man who wrote down every cent that came in and went out in a handwriting that was cramped but consistent, and nothing had been hidden or misrepresented. The disaster was simpler than that. He was a man who understood cattle and land and weather and work, and understood almost nothing about the difference between what something cost to produce and what it was worth to sell. How was buying feed in small quantities from the general store in town, which meant he was paying the retail markup instead of the bulk rate he could have gotten by ordering directly from the supply depot in Billings. He was selling his beef to one buyer, a man named Reese, who ran the town's butcher operation at a flat rate that had not been renegotiated in 3 years, despite the fact that Charlotte knew from the newspapers she'd read on the train that beef prices had risen considerably in the interim. He was paying a hired hand named Coop a fair wage for work that was being split 3 ways when it should have been organized differently. None of these were moral failures. They were the natural mistakes of a man who had been trying to hold too many things together by himself for too long, and had run out of energy to question whether he was holding them the right way. Charlotte sat at the desk until the light outside changed, and the smell of burned coffee from the kitchen made its way through the wall, and she wrote numbers in the margin of his ledger page in her own careful hand, and when she was done, she had a clear picture of exactly how much waste was in the system, and exactly how much of it could be fixed without anyone needing to work harder than they already were. She heard the creak of the floorboard in the doorway. "Supper's ready," Wyatt said, "such as it is." "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said without looking up. "Ask." "The buyer in town, Reese. Do you have a signed contract with him, or is it a handshake arrangement?" A pause. "Handshake. Good." She made another note. "There's a settlement called Red Fork about 20 miles east. They've been trying to establish a regular beef supply for their new boarding house, and they're paying 15 cents per pound above what Reese is offering you. I read about it in the Billings paper on the train. If we divert even half your current output—" "You read the Billings paper," Wyatt said very slowly. "I read everything available on the train. I had 3 days and there wasn't much else to do." She finally looked up. "You're losing approximately $40 a month in avoidable costs, Mr. Dawson. Not through any fault of your judgment on the land itself. Through purchasing habits that made sense when you started and don't anymore. I can show you the figures." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, yet something careful and uncertain, and not unwelcoming. "You figured all that out tonight," he said. "From those books. The books are clear. You're a careful record keeper." "I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" He shifted in the doorway, hat in his hands, turning it once around by the brim, in the unconscious way of a man working out what to say. "I thought you might need some time to settle in," he said finally. "Before getting into all of this." Charlotte closed the ledger carefully. "Mr. Dawson, I came here because I had nowhere else to go and no other options available to me. You chose me in front of a room full of people who made clear what they thought of that choice." She set her pencil down. "I am not going to repay that by being a woman who needs time to settle in. If there is a problem with this ranch that I can help fix, I would like to begin fixing it. Is that acceptable to you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am, it's acceptable." "Good." She stood up. "Now, you said supper was ready." The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but close to one. "Burned beans and hard bread," he said. "I should warn you, I've had worse." She moved toward the doorway, and he stepped back to let her through. "Tomorrow morning, I'd like to look at the garden. And I'll need to know which of your cattle are currently below market weight, because there may be a feeding adjustment that can accelerate." "Miss Bennett." She stopped. He was looking at her with that same careful, unreadable expression, and something else in it now that she hadn't seen before. "Thank you," he said, "for not—" He stopped again like the words were giving him trouble. "For not walking the other direction." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "Get the coffee off the stove before it burns entirely," she said. "We'll talk about the rest over supper." 3 days into her time at the Broken D, the neighbors arrived. There were 2 of them, women from the adjacent properties, riding together with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. The first was a lean, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 named Pearl Hartley, whose husband ran the largest cattle operation north of the creek. The second was younger, softer-faced, and introduced herself as June Alderman, wife of the town's general store owner. They arrived mid-morning, tying their horses at the repaired section of the fence. Charlotte had fixed the porch railing the morning before, and moved on to the fence posts and watching her work with identical expressions of undisguised curiosity. "You're the one Wyatt bought at the auction," Pearl said without preamble. "Charlotte Bennett," Charlotte said, straightening up with the hammer still in her hand. "You can call me Charlie if you like." "People are talking," Pearl said. "People usually are. They're saying Wyatt spent his last $2. He did." Pearl looked at this fence post, at the hammer, at the straight solid line of repaired railing running along the porch, then back at Charlotte. "Where'd you learn to do that?" she said. "My father's store. You learn to fix what's broken when you can't afford to replace it." June, the softer one, glanced at the house. "Is Wyatt inside?" "He's moving the cattle to the north pasture. He'll be back for the midday meal." Charlotte looked at both of them steadily. "Is there something specific you came to say, or are you here to satisfy curiosity? Either way is fine. I just want to know which conversation we're having." Pearl looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a short, startled sound like she hadn't quite expected it. "You're not what I was expecting," she said. "What were you expecting?" The women they bring from out east usually spend the first week crying, June said almost apologetically. I don't see the use in it, Charlotte said. Pearl dismounted. Well, she said, looking at the fence work again. You're doing that repair wrong. The post needs to go 2 inches deeper on the north side, or the first good wind will have it down by morning. She held out her hand. Give me the hammer. Charlotte looked at her. Then she handed over the hammer, and Pearl Hartley, who had lived on the Montana frontier for 30 years and could read a person the way other women read. Scripture knelt down in the dirt in her good skirt and showed her how to do it right. That evening, Wyatt came in from the north pasture to find Charlotte at the kitchen table with a letter half written in front of her. What's that? He asked. A letter to the supply depot in Billings, Charlotte said, requesting a price sheet for bulk feed orders, and one to the Red Fork boarding house asking about their beef supply contract, and one to the county land office because I want to understand the exact terms of your loan paperwork, specifically whether the accrual method they're using is consistent with the terms you actually signed, because from what I saw in your ledger, it may not be. Wyatt stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at 3 letters in various stages of completion spread across his table. You wrote all those today, he said. I also fixed 3 fence posts and aired out the back room. She looked up. Did you eat anything at midday? He stopped. No. Sit down. There's stew. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and she got up and ladled out the stew, properly seasoned actual vegetables in it. Nothing burned, and put it in front of him and went back to her letter. He ate in silence for a moment. Pearl Hartley stopped by, Charlotte said without looking up. I know, she told me. A pause. She also told me the fence posts look better than the ones her husband put in last spring. She helped. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Pearl doesn't help most people. She helped me. Yeah. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I noticed. Charlotte finished the sentence she was writing and looked up. Mr. Dawson, she said, can I ask you something personal? He held her gaze. Ask. What made you choose me? The question sat between them. He didn't look away from it. You weren't crying, he said finally. She waited. Everyone else on that platform, he said slowly, was either crying or performing, trying to look like what they thought the men in the room wanted. And you were... He paused. You were just standing there, hands flat, eyes up, like you were daring the room to do its worst. Charlotte didn't say anything. I know what that looks like, he said quietly. I've been doing it for 3 years. The lamp between them burned low and steady. The town laughed, she said, when you put the money down. They did. Does that bother you? He considered it genuinely the way he considered most things slowly without performance. No, he said. Not particularly. I've been the subject of town talk before. It fades. He looked at her. Does it bother you what they said about you up there? Charlotte was quiet for a moment. It bothers me less than it used to, she said carefully. I've been hearing versions of it since I was 12 years old. You develop... She stopped. You develop a kind of armor. But armor's heavy, and it doesn't always fit right. No, he said. It doesn't. They sat in the quiet for a while. Outside the Montana, dark had come in fully, and the night sounds of the property settled around the house, the cattle in the distance, the slow creak of the barn, the wind moving across the open land. The loan payment, Charlotte said finally. The one due in 6 weeks. Yeah. I think we can make it. He looked at her. Not with what you're currently bringing in, she said. But if we redirect the beef sales and cut the feed costs by switching to bulk orders and renegotiate the price on the Red Fork contract, which I think they'll agree to because they need the supply more than we need the sale, I think we can cover the payment and have $12 left. She met his eyes. It's not comfortable, but it's not impossible. Wyatt was very still. You've been here 3 days, he said. I know, and you already know how to save this ranch. I know how to fix the financial structure, she said. Saving the ranch is your job. I can just make sure the numbers support it. He looked at her for a long time across the table. "Miss Bennett," he said with a weight in his voice she hadn't heard before. "You are not what I expected either." Charlotte picked up her pen. "Nobody ever is," she said. "Now finish your stew. We have letters to post tomorrow morning, and I want to leave at first light." Outside, the wind moved across the broken D. Inside, two people who had each been written off in their own way sat across a kitchen table in the lamplight, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt entirely alone. The letters went out the next morning before the town was fully awake. Charlotte had them sealed and addressed by the time Wyatt came in from the early feeding, and she handed them to him at the door with a list of what each one said, and what response she was expecting, and by when. He stood there in the thin morning light, reading the list, with the focused attention of a man who was trying to reconcile what he was looking at with what he had believed to be true about his situation up until approximately 72 hours ago. "You want me to post all 3 this morning," he said, "before the bank opens. If we run into Garfield from the trust office, I don't want him to know we're moving on the Red Fork contract before we've had a chance to lock in the price." Wyatt looked up. "You know who runs my loan?" "I asked Pearl yesterday." Charlotte was already back at the table with the ledger. "She said he passes the post office at 9 every morning, so we need to go at 8. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put on his hat and said, "I'll bring the wagon around." The town of Dust Creek watched them arrive, the way small towns watch everything from windows and doorways, and the corners of conversations that paused just long enough to take note. Charlotte felt the attention the moment the wagon rolled onto the main street. She had felt it before in other towns, in other rooms, her whole life. That specific quality of public awareness that attached itself to a person who did not fit the expected shape of things. She sat straight on the wagon bench and looked forward. Wyatt tied the horses at the post office rail and came around to her side without any particular ceremony, simply offering his hand to help her down. She took it, and they walked into the post office together, and the postmaster, a small man with enormous eyebrows, who introduced himself as Mr. Fenwick, accepted the 3 letters with the polished disinterest of a man who handled other people's business all day, and had learned to make very little of it, until he looked at the address on the 3rd envelope. "Red Fork Boarding House," he said with a slight lift of those extraordinary eyebrows. "That's right," Charlotte said. "Business inquiry." "Yes." He looked at her, at Wyatt, back at the letters. "Wyatt Dawson doing business with Red Fork," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of a man filing away information for later distribution. "That'll be the postage for all 3, Mr. Fenwick," Charlotte said pleasantly. He named the price. She counted out the exact coins from the small purse at her wrist and placed them on the counter without comment, and they were back out the door before 9 o'clock and well clear of the main street before Garfield from the bank trust office appeared at the end of the block with his briefcase and his proprietary expression. Wyatt noticed the timing. "You planned that," he said, climbing up onto the wagon. "I planned for the possibility that it might matter," Charlotte said. "It turned out to matter." He looked at her with that steady recalibrating expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being surprised. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he said. "Running a store that was always 6 weeks from closing," Charlotte said. "You learn to stay ahead of the problems, or the problems stay ahead of you." He clicked the horses into motion. "How long was your father's store open?" he said. 18 years. A pause. "He died when I was 22. The debt died with him, but so did the building. I ran it for another 2 years, trying to get it stable, and then the landlord sold the property out from under me." She said it without self-pity, as plain fact the way people talk about things they have had enough time to process. "I came out here because there was nothing left in Tennessee to stay for, and the agency in Nashville said there were opportunities out west for capable women." "Capable women," he repeated. "That's what the flyer said. And then they put you on an auction platform." "And then they put me on an auction platform," she agreed. "So, capable is perhaps a relative term in this context." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not relative on the broken D." Charlotte glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead at the trail, jaw set, hands easy on the reins, and he did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. But she felt it land somewhere inside her chest. That sentence quiet and direct as everything else about him, and she turned back to look at the road ahead and said nothing and let it settle. The response from Red Fork came back in 4 days. Charlotte was in the kitchen garden when Wyatt brought the letter out from the mailbox, and she wiped her hands on her apron and took it and read it standing there among the half-recovered tomato plants, with Wyatt watching from 3 feet away. "Well," he said. "They want to meet," she said. "Thursday. They're interested in a contract, but they want to see the cattle first." She lowered the letter. "And they're offering 17 cents per pound above what Reese is paying you." Wyatt stared at her. 17 above. Above. She handed him the letter. "Mr. Greaves. He's the one running the boarding house. He says they've been trying to establish a reliable local supply for months, and the Billings beef is costing them too much in transport. He wants a 2-year agreement." He read the letter, read it again, looked up. "Charlotte," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without the formal miss in front of it. She noticed, but she didn't remark on it. "We need to prepare the cattle before Thursday," she said. "Which ones are in the best condition?" "The 6 on the north pasture." "Then we take those. And I need you to let me do most of the talking with Greaves." He frowned. "You want to negotiate it yourself?" "I want to negotiate it correctly," she said. "And I know what numbers we need to make the loan payment and have breathing room. You know everything about the cattle, so if he has specific questions about the quality and the feeding, you answer those. But on price and terms, let me lead." He looked at her for a long moment. "Most men wouldn't let a woman lead the negotiation," he said. It wasn't a challenge, it was an observation. "Most men aren't 6 weeks from losing their ranch," Charlotte said. Something moved in his face, not offense. Something closer to recognition. "Fair enough," he said. They went to Red Fork on Thursday. The ride was long enough that they had to leave before dawn, and Charlotte spent the first hour of it going over the numbers in her head, while Wyatt drove, and the dark prairie rolled out around them in that particular pre-dawn silence that felt like the world taking a breath before committing to the day. "Tell me about your Honthe," she said somewhere in the second hour, when the sky had started to lighten. He didn't answer right away. She hadn't expected him to. "Her name was Clara," he said finally. "We were engaged for 2 years. She was from a good family in Colorado, came out to see the ranch once." He paused. "That was when the first drought hit. The place looked bad. The money was worse. She wrote me a letter 3 months later saying she didn't think she could build a life on land that was fighting her at every turn." He said it evenly without visible bitterness, which told Charlotte that he had said it to himself enough times that the sharp edges had been worn down. "She married a lawyer in Denver. I heard she's doing well. Do you hate her for it?" "No." A long pause. "I understand it. I just stopped believing after that anyone would choose this life unless they didn't have another option." Charlotte was quiet. "Which is why you bought me," she said. "I bought you," he said, "because you were the only person in that room who looked the crowd in the eye." He turned briefly to look at her. "Clara never did that, not once in 2 years." He turned back to the trail. "I knew it when I was with her, and I ignored it. A woman who looks away every time things get hard is going to keep looking away." The sky ahead of them was going pink at the edges. "I don't look away," Charlotte said. "No," Wyatt said. "You don't." Mr. Greaves turned out to be a stout, practical man of 50, who shook Charlotte's hand without hesitation when Wyatt introduced her as the one handling the business side of the operation, and who listened to her proposed contract terms with the focused attention of someone who recognized a well-prepared person when he encountered one. They sat at his office table in Red Fork for 2 hours. Charlotte laid out the pricing structure, the delivery schedule, the quality guarantees, and the terms for renegotiation at the end of the first year. She had written it all on 3 pages of paper in her careful hand, and she set the pages in front of Greaves and walked him through each section without hurrying and without apologizing for any of it. Greaves asked 6 questions. Charlotte answered 5 immediately and took the 6th, a technical question about winter feeding weight maintenance, and turned to Wyatt, who answered it with the precise, confident knowledge of a man who had been doing this for 11 years. Greaves looked at both of them. "I like doing business with people who know their business," he said. "Then we should work well together," Charlotte said. He smiled and reached for his pen. They were back on the road to Dust Creek by early afternoon, with a signed 2-year contract terms more favorable than Charlotte had originally hoped for, and enough secured income to cover the loan payment with $43 to spare. Wyatt didn't say anything for the first mile. Then he said, $43. "Yes. We had $12 4 days ago." "We had the potential for $43 4 days ago," Charlotte said. The letters just confirmed it. Another long silence. "What do we do with the 43? He said. 18 goes back into feed. 12 into repair materials. The barn roof needs to happen before winter. The remaining 13 we hold in reserve for the next payment cycle." She looked at him. "We're not clear yet, Mr. Dawson. We've bought ourselves time, that's all." "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." He let out a long, slow breath, the kind that carries more than just air, that has the weight of 3 years of sustained grinding worry in it, and something in his shoulders came down a fraction of an inch. Not relaxation exactly, but the slight, careful lowering of a man who has been braced against a blow that has not yet come and is beginning cautiously to consider that it might not. Charlotte watched it happen and felt something twist in her chest that she wasn't prepared to name yet. "John." Coop, the hired hand, was waiting at the barn when they got back. He was a weathered man of about 60, with a permanently squinted expression that might have been the sun, or might have been his general disposition, and he had worked the Broken D for 3 years with the quiet, unhurried competence of someone who'd been doing ranch work his whole life and saw no reason to speed up now. He looked at Charlotte, the way he'd been looking at her for 3 days, with the specific wariness of a man who has developed a comfortable routine and is watching it get reorganized around him. "Letter came while you were gone," he said to Wyatt. "From the bank." Wyatt's jaw tightened. Charlotte saw it. "Give it here," she said. Coop looked at Wyatt. "Give it to her," Wyatt said. Coop handed it over with the particular expression of a man choosing his battles. Charlotte opened it and read it standing in the yard, and what she felt when she finished reading it was not exactly surprise. She had been watching for something like this, but it was the particular cold clarity of a threat that has moved from theoretical to actual. The letter was from Gerald Garfield at the Dust Creek Savings and Trust. It informed Wyatt Dawson that given the deteriorating condition of the property and the outstanding loan balance, the bank was exercising its right under Section 4 of the loan agreement to conduct a formal property assessment within the next 14 days, the outcome of which would determine whether the loan could continue to be carried or whether the bank would need to call the full balance immediately. "What does it mean?" Coop said. "It means the bank wants to come look at the property," Charlotte said, folding the letter precisely. "And depending on what they find, they may demand full repayment of the entire loan rather than the monthly payments." "Full repayment," Coop repeated. $400 and $412, Charlotte said. "Yes." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a number that is impossible. Wyatt took the letter from her. Read it. His face had gone very still. 14 days, he said. 14 days, Charlotte confirmed. "Which means we have 2 weeks to make this property look like a viable operation, or the bank can legally call the entire debt due." She looked at him steadily. "Can you borrow against anything to cover $400 if they demand it?" "No." "Do you have anyone who would lend it at short notice?" "No." "Then we need to make the property look viable." She looked at Coop. "Starting with the barn roof, how long will it take if the 3 of us work on it together?" Coop stared at her. "You want to work on the barn roof?" "I want to know how long it will take," Charlotte said. "The answer to the first question is yes." Coop looked at Wyatt again, with the expression of a man confirming that the world had in fact changed while he wasn't paying attention. 3 days, he said. "If we start tomorrow and the weather holds." "Then we start tomorrow," Charlotte said. "What else is visible from the main approach that would concern an assessor?" They made a list that night. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, Coop included, though he did it with the self-conscious awkwardness of a man not accustomed to being consulted, and Charlotte wrote down every deficiency on the property that a bank assessor walking the grounds might flag as evidence of neglect or failing operation. It was a long list. "There's no way to fix all of this in 14 days, Coop said flatly halfway through. "We're not trying to fix all of it," Charlotte said. "We're trying to fix the things that tell a story." An assessor makes a judgment in the first 10 minutes. What does he see when he comes up the road? What does he see when he gets out of his buggy? What does he see when he walks to the barn? She tapped the list. "These are the things we fix. The rest can wait." "She's right," Wyatt said. Coop looked at him, then at Charlotte, then back at his coffee. "I've been running cattle for 40 years, he said. "Never had a woman tell me what needed fixing on a ranch before." "How many of those ranches are still operating?" Charlotte asked. Coop opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not asking to be unkind," Charlotte said. "I'm asking because if you've seen what works and what doesn't, your experience is valuable, and I want it. There are things about this land and this operation that you understand better than I ever will. And there are things I can see in the numbers that nobody living close to the problem can see anymore." She looked at him directly. "We need both." Coop was quiet for a long moment. "The east fence is down in 2 places, he said finally. An assessor from the bank would note that first thing. "Add it to the list," Charlotte said, and slid him the pencil. He took it, sat there for a moment looking at it like it was a slightly unusual object. Then he started writing. They worked for 11 straight days. Charlotte had not fully understood before those 11 days what her body was capable of. She had known she was strong, had known it in the abstract way of someone who has always done physical work, but she had spent so much of her life hearing what she couldn't do. Watching people look at her and make their calculations based on what they saw, rather than what they knew that some part of her had begun to file those assessments in a corner of herself and believe them. The broken D cured her of that quickly. She was up before dawn every morning in the kitchen by 5, feeding the men who were working the repairs before the heat settled in, then out with them by 7, doing whatever needed to be done. She hauled lumber for the barn roof without being asked. She painted the front face of the house while Wyatt and Coop replaced the broken sections of fence. She replanted the kitchen garden in neat productive rows, with seeds she traded Pearl Hartley for a day's help with Pearl's own kitchen repairs. A transaction Pearl had accepted with a single raised eyebrow, and what Charlotte was coming to recognize as the older woman's version of enthusiasm. On the 4th day, Wyatt came to find her behind the barn, where she was working on the second fence section, and stood watching her for a moment before he said anything. "You don't have to do this part," he said. "Coop and I can—" "I know I don't have to," Charlotte said, setting a post. "I want to. Are you going to tell me I'm doing it wrong?" "No, you're doing it right." A pause. "Pearl showed you." "Pearl showed me." How was quiet. She could feel him looking at her, not in the assessing way of the men at the auction, but in the careful, particular way she had come to associate with him, working something out internally. "Your hands are going to be sore tomorrow," he said. "They're sore today," Charlotte said. "I'll live." "Charlotte." She stopped and looked up. He was holding out a pair of leather work gloves, the good kind, slightly worn, but well-fitted, the kind a man buys once and keeps for years. "These were my mother's," he said. She had hands about your size." He held them out a little further in the specific manner of a man who would rather not examine the gesture too closely while he was making it. "You should wear them." Charlotte looked at the gloves. She knew enough about Wyatt Dawson by now to understand what it meant when he offered something that had belonged to someone he had loved. She took them. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned back to his section of the fence, and didn't say anything else about it, and she put the gloves on, and went back to work, and neither of them mentioned it again. But she wore them every day after that. The night before the assessor was due to arrive was the first night Charlotte could not sleep. She lay in the small back room, her room hers now, in a way that had shifted quietly over the past 2 weeks from temporary to something else she didn't have a word for, and stared at the ceiling and ran the numbers again. She had run them so many times they had started to feel like a prayer, or like the opposite of prayer, depending on how superstitious a person was willing to be about arithmetic. The property looked better. She knew that. She had walked it herself that afternoon with the specific cold eye of someone trying to see what a stranger would see, and it looked better. Not finished, not perfect, but alive. The difference between a property in the slow visible process of failing and a property in the early visible stages of recovery. Whether the assessor would see the same thing depended entirely on what he was looking for. And whether what he was looking for had anything to do with the actual state of the property was a question she had been carefully not asking herself, because the answer to that question had to do with Nathan Cole. And Nathan Cole was a problem she had identified 3 days ago and not yet figured out how to solve. She had heard his name first from Pearl. "You know who holds the note on your husband's loan," Pearl had said one morning over the garden fence with the particular careful tone of a woman delivering information she believes the other person needs. "The Dust Creek Savings and Trust," Charlotte said. "And you know who sits on the board of the Dust Creek Savings and Trust." Charlotte had gone still. "Tell me." "Nathan Cole," Pearl said. "He owns the controlling interest, has for 6 years. She paused. "His property borders the Broken D on the west side. He's been trying to acquire that land for 3 years. Charlotte had known immediately and completely what that meant. She had stood at the garden fence and felt the entire shape of the problem resolve itself with horrible clarity. The compounding interest that had pushed the debt beyond what Wyatt could service, the timing of the assessment demand that had come exactly 1 week after the Red Fork contract had been posted, the particular wording of Section 4 of the loan agreement that she had gone back and read twice before she believed what it said. Nathan Cole didn't want to be paid back. Nathan Cole wanted the land. And now his assessor was coming tomorrow morning. She was still staring at the ceiling when she heard the floorboard creak in the hallway. A pause, then a knock at her door, light but deliberate. "You're awake," Wyatt said through the door. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Me too." She got up and opened the door. He was standing in the hallway in his work clothes. He'd apparently never changed out of them, with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had also been lying awake doing arithmetic. She took one of the cups, and they walked to the front porch and sat in the dark, side by side on the steps, the way people sit when the conversation they need to have is too heavy to have standing up. "You found out about Cole," Wyatt said. 3 days ago. I should have told you from the start." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You should have." He accepted that without arguing. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if I fix the financials, the loan, the property—" "He doesn't want the money, Wyatt." It was the first time she'd used his name without any formal distance in it. "He wants the land, the water rights. A man like that doesn't stop because you make a payment." "I know." "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" "I don't have one," he said quietly. Charlotte held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the dark shape of the property that they had spent 11 days putting back together. "I have half of one," she said. He turned to look at her. "The loan agreement," she said. "Section 4. The language that allows them to demand a full assessment." "What about it?" "I read it carefully. The clause requires that the property be evaluated by an independent assessor." That's the word they used, independent, meaning not employed by or financially associated with the lender. She looked at him. "Nathan Cole owns the bank. If the assessor he sends is employed by Cole directly, or if Cole has any personal financial interest in the outcome of the assessment, the clause is invalid." Wyatt was very still. "You think Cole owns the assessor?" "I think it would be remarkable if he didn't," Charlotte said. "Men like Cole don't leave that kind of thing to chance." She paused. "What I need is to find out who Cole's sending and whether there's a financial connection I can document. If I can establish that the assessor isn't independent, the assessment is legally void, the clause doesn't apply, and Cole can't call the loan early." "How would you get that kind of information by morning?" Charlotte wrapped both hands around her cup. "I was hoping," she said, "that Pearl Hartley might know." She was at Pearl's door by 5 in the morning. Pearl opened it before Charlotte could knock a second time, fully dressed with the look of a woman who had also not slept and had been expecting this conversation. "Come in," Pearl said. "Coffee's already on." They sat at Pearl's kitchen table, and Charlotte laid out what she had found in the loan agreement and Pearl listened with the focused attention of a woman who had been watching Nathan Cole operate in this county for 2 decades. "The assessor he uses is a man named Fletcher," Pearl said when Charlotte finished. "Jerome Fletcher. He runs a property valuation office in Billings, but Cole financed the office 6 years ago. Gave him the startup loan." She looked at Charlotte steadily. "Cole forgave that loan last year. It was in the county records." Charlotte felt something drop into place in her chest, like a key into a lock. "Is the county record public?" "It's public." Pearl stood up and went to the sideboard and pulled open the bottom drawer and removed a folder of papers. "I've been keeping copies," she said, "in case someone ever needed them." She set the folder on the table. Charlotte opened it, found the record, read it through twice. "Pearl," she said, "how long have you been waiting for someone to use this?" Pearl sat back down and picked up her coffee. "Since the third man Cole forced off his property," she said. "But none of them had anyone who could read a loan agreement." She looked at Charlotte with an expression that contained somewhere underneath the practical exterior, something that might have been hope. "You can, can't you?" "I can," Charlotte said. "Then use it," Pearl said. Fletcher arrived at the Broken D at 10 o'clock, precisely driving a clean buggy and wearing an assessor's expression, professionally. Neutral, privately satisfied, the look of a man who knows what conclusion he is coming to reach. He introduced himself to Wyatt at the gate and asked to begin with the main structure. Wyatt said, "My wife handles the paperwork side of things. She'd like to show you something first." Fletcher turned. Charlotte was standing 3 feet away, with a document in one hand and the county record in the other, and she looked at him with exactly the same expression she had worn on the auction platform 3 weeks ago. Chin up, eyes direct, not asking for anything. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, "before we begin, I need to draw your attention to Section 4 of the Broken D Loan Agreement, which specifies that the assessment must be conducted by an independent evaluator. I also need to show you a county record from the Billings Land Office, documenting Nathan Cole's financial relationship with your valuation firm, which was established in 1872 and concluded with a forgiven debt in 1877. She held out both documents. "As you'll see, this constitutes a material conflict of interest that invalidates the assessment clause under the terms of the original agreement." Fletcher stared at the documents. He did not take them. "I don't think you understand how this process—" "I understand the process precisely, Mr. Fletcher," Charlotte said. "I also understand that proceeding with this assessment under these circumstances would expose both you and the bank to a legal challenge that would be documented, submitted to the county courthouse, and made available to every property owner in this county." She held the papers out a little further. "I'm going to ask you to look at these, and then I'm going to ask you to decide whether Nathan Cole's interest in this property is worth that exposure to you personally." The silence that followed was long and very specific. Fletcher took the documents. He read them. The professionally neutral expression did not hold under the weight of what he was reading. He looked up at Charlotte, then at Wyatt, then back at Charlotte. "I'll need to consult with the bank," he said at last in the voice of a man whose morning has gone considerably differently than planned. "Of course," Charlotte said. "We'll be here." He climbed back into his buggy and drove away down the road. Wyatt stood beside her and watched him go. "Did that work?" he said quietly. "I don't know yet," Charlotte said. "But you did it anyway." "I did what the evidence supported." She lowered the documents to her side. "We'll find out what Cole does next." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her fully, openly, with none of the careful reserve that he normally wore the way other men wore their hats, and she felt the weight of that look land on her like a hand pressed flat against a place that had been cold for a very long time. "Charlotte," he said. "Wyatt, whatever happens next." He paused. "You need to know I'm not sorry, for any of it, for what I spent, for who I spent it on." The air between them held still. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had put his last $2 on a stranger because something in him refused to participate in what the room was doing and felt something give way quietly inside her chest. Not the armor exactly, but the weight of it. "Neither am I," she said, And then, because they were both people who understood that some things are more safely left in the space between words than pressed too quickly into them, they turned back to the property that they had built back together piece by piece over 11 impossible days and went back to work. Fletcher never came back. That was the first thing Charlotte noticed when she woke the next morning, the absence of what she had been bracing for. No buggy on the road. No follow-up letter from the bank. No messenger from Nathan Cole, arriving with some new document designed to reframe what had happened at the gate. Just the ordinary sounds of the broken D at dawn coop moving in the barn. Wyatt's boots on the porch, the smell of coffee working its way through the wall. She lay still for a moment and let the silence tell her what it meant. It meant Cole was rethinking, which meant she had bought time. Not victory, not safety, just time, which was what she had learned to trade in back in Tennessee, when the store was always 6 weeks from failing, and every good week was just a slightly better position from which to fight the next bad one. She got up and started breakfast, and did not allow herself to feel relieved, because relief was a feeling that belonged to people who were done, and she was not done. Wyatt came in from the porch with the look of a man who had been standing in the cold air long enough to settle something in himself. He poured his coffee and sat across from her at the table and said, "He's going to come back at us differently." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You already know how." "I have 2 guesses," she said. "He'll either try to discredit the county document, argue it doesn't constitute a conflict under the loan terms, or he'll find another angle entirely. Something that doesn't involve the assessment clause." "What kind of angle?" "That," Charlotte said, setting a plate in front of him, "is what worries me." Cole made his move 4 days later, and it was neither of the things she had guessed. It came in the form of a social call. He rode up to the Broken D on a Thursday afternoon on a horse that cost more than the ranch's monthly income, wearing clothes that made the same point without saying it aloud, and he knocked on the front door with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has never in his adult life stood outside a door that he did not eventually enter on his own terms. Wyatt opened the door. Cole smiled a wide, practiced smile, the kind that had been deployed so many times in so many negotiations that it had lost any connection to actual warmth and just operated on its own, now like a mechanism. "Wyatt," he said. "Good to see you looking well. I heard your property's been undergoing some improvements." "Cole," Wyatt said, not moving from the doorway. "I wanted to come by personally," Cole said to clear the air. "There seems to have been some confusion with the assessment process. My intention was never to cause alarm. I simply wanted to ensure the bank's investment is adequately protected." "Your investment," Wyatt said. "The bank's investment," Cole said with a slight adjustment of the smile. "Same thing in practical terms. May I come in?" "No," said Charlotte. She appeared at Wyatt's shoulder. She had been in the kitchen. She had heard the voice from the moment the horse came up the drive, and she had taken off her apron and folded it on the table, and walked to the door with the particular deliberateness of a woman who is choosing every step, and she stood beside Wyatt and looked at Nathan Cole directly. Cole's eyes moved to her, and in that first unguarded second, before the smile fully reassembled itself, she saw what was actually there, not contempt, not dismissal, but the specific recalculation of a man encountering something he had not factored into his planning. He had heard about her, she realized. He had known she existed. He had not known yet what that meant. Now he was finding out. "Mrs. Dawson," he said with a shallow tilt of his hat. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "You know who I am," Charlotte said. "And I know who you are. And I know what you want. So unless you've come here to tell us you're releasing the pressure on this loan and leaving this property alone, I don't think there's much for us to talk about standing on this porch." The smile didn't falter, but something behind it went very still. "My," he said softly. "Wyatt, where did you find her?" "She found herself," Wyatt said. "Is there something you actually need, Cole, or did you ride out here to hear yourself talk?" Cole looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes was almost visible. "I came," he said with the carefully measured patience of a man who has decided to change tactics mid-conversation, "to make you an offer, a fair one. 30 cents per acre for the full Broken D property. That's above market value. You'd walk away clear of the debt with money in your pocket, And you could start fresh somewhere that isn't fighting you at every turn." Wyatt said nothing. Charlotte said no. Cole's eyes went to her again. "Mrs. Dawson, I'd encourage you to let your husband consider—" "He's considered it," Charlotte said. "The answer is no. This land isn't for sale. Not at 30 cents an acre. Not at $3. Not at any price you're willing to name because you don't want to pay a fair price for land. You want to push a man off a property. He built himself because it has water rights that would double the value of your own holdings to the north." She watched his face. "I've looked at the county land records, Mr. Cole. I know exactly what this property is worth to you, and it is considerably more than what you're offering." The smile had gone now. What was underneath it was harder and more honest. "You're a very educated woman for an auction purchase," he said. Wyatt took a step forward. Charlotte put her hand on his arm. One touch flat and steady, and he stopped. "I'm educated enough," Charlotte said, "to know that what you just said tells me exactly how worried you are." She looked at him levelly. "Have a safe ride back, Mr. Cole." She stepped back. Wyatt stepped back, and she closed the door. The sound of Cole's horse leaving the property was the loudest thing in the house for a full 30 seconds. Then Coop's voice came from the back of the hallway. "He's gone," Wyatt said. Coop appeared from the kitchen, where he had apparently been listening with great attentiveness to a pot of beans that required no particular supervision. "That was either the bravest thing I ever saw," he said, looking at Charlotte, "or the stupidest." "It was necessary," Charlotte said. "He came here to take our measure. If we'd let him in, offered coffee, been polite and accommodating, he'd have walked out knowing exactly how frightened we were, and he'd have pressed harder." She moved back toward the kitchen. "Now he knows we're not frightened. That changes what he does next." "Or it makes him angry," Coop said. "It makes him angry," Charlotte agreed. "But angry men make faster decisions, and faster decisions are sloppier ones." She picked up her apron. "I'd rather fight a man who's moving too fast than one who's taking his time." Coop looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Coop. "She's right," Wyatt said. "I know she is," Coop said in the specific tone of a man who finds this both impressive and deeply inconvenient to his worldview. "That's what bothers me." Cole's anger arrived faster than Charlotte had expected. 6 days after the porch conversation, someone cut the fence on the north pasture. Not the whole fence. Just a 30-foot section on the far side of the property, the section farthest from the house where a man working quickly in the dark could do it in 15 minutes and be back across the property line before dawn. Enough to let Wyatt's 6 best cattle, the ones under the Red Fork contract, wander north onto Cole's land, where they would technically be trespassing, and therefore subject to impoundment under county law. Wyatt found them gone at the morning feeding and had the particular expression of a man who already knows what has happened before he goes to look at the fence. He came back in at 7 and stood in the kitchen doorway and told Charlotte what he'd found with the flat, controlled voice of someone keeping a much larger emotion on a very short leash. Charlotte put down her coffee cup. "How long do we have before he files for impoundment?" she said. "If he found them this morning, maybe until noon. After that, he can legally hold them for up to 48 hours and charge a recovery fee." "How much is the recovery fee?" "Per head per day, 6 cattle 2 days. He did the math. It could be $60–70. "We don't have $60, Charlotte said. "Not as a complaint. As a fact to be worked around." "No," Wyatt said. "We don't." She was already untying her apron. "Get Coop and get the wagon." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go get our cattle back," Charlotte said before he files the paperwork. Cole's property was 12 minutes north by wagon, which gave Charlotte 12 minutes to work out exactly what she was going to say when she got there. She spent the first 8 thinking and the last 4 watching the tension in Wyatt's hands on the reins and making herself breathe slowly. Cole was standing in his yard when the wagon pulled up, which told her he had been expecting them. He watched them climb down with the satisfied expression of a man who has set a trap and is watching it work. "Wyatt," he said pleasantly, "come to collect strays." "Our fence was cut," Wyatt said. Cole arranged his face into something that resembled surprise. Terrible thing. Country's full of vandals. He shook his head. I found your cattle on my land this morning. I was just about to head into town and file the impoundment papers. You haven't filed yet, Charlotte said. Cole's eyes moved to her with the specific quality of attention he had been giving her since the porch, that careful, recalculating look. Not yet, he agreed. I was being neighborly, giving Wyatt a chance to come collect them first. How generous, Charlotte said. In that case, we'd like to collect them now. There is the matter of the grazing damage, Cole said. My land, my grass, 6 cattle eating on it overnight. I'd say that warrants a courtesy payment, being neighborly and all. What number did you have in mind? Charlotte said. $30 seems fair. We don't have $30, Wyatt said flatly. Cole spread his hands. That's unfortunate. I suppose I'll have to. I have a counteroffer, Charlotte said. Cole paused. He was enjoying himself. She could see that the enjoyment of a man who believes the trap has fully closed. But he was curious. She had noticed that about him. He was a man who was interested in people who surprised him even when they were inconveniencing him. I'm listening, he said. You want this land, Charlotte said. We know that, and you know that we know that. The water rights on the Broken D's west side are worth approximately $12,000 to your operation over 10 years based on current grazing rates. She watched his face. I've done the calculation. You can argue the number if you like, but we'll end up very close to the same place. Cole said nothing. He was listening. You cannot acquire this land through the loan, she continued. The assessment clause is invalid. We can demonstrate that, and we will publicly if you force us to. You cannot acquire it through impoundment of 6 cattle, because the recovery fee doesn't create a debt large enough to threaten the property. She paused. What you can do is keep cutting fences and poisoning wells, and doing whatever else you're planning, and we'll keep documenting it and filing incident reports with the county sheriff, and in 6 months you'll have a record that any competent lawyer in Montana can use against you, and you'll still not have the land. The humor had left Cole's face. What's your point, Mrs. Dawson? My point, Charlotte said, is that there is a version of this where you get what you actually want without destroying a family to get it. She held his gaze. We are willing to negotiate a water access agreement, a paid easement for the water rights on the west quarter. You get the water access you need. We keep the land. You pay us a fair annual rate that helps service the loan. Everyone stops fighting. The silence that followed was long enough to hear the cattle in Cole's field. Then Cole looked at Wyatt. Is this her idea or yours? He said. Does it matter? Wyatt said. I'm asking. It's our idea, Wyatt said. Same thing. Cole looked at Charlotte for a long moment. The calculation was visible again, and this time it was more complex. A man running numbers against a timeline against a risk. He had not fully anticipated when he looked at a woman on an auction platform and assumed she was the same category of problem as all the other problems he had ever managed by wearing them down. She wasn't. He was beginning to understand that. I'll think about it, he said. Take the cattle home first, Charlotte said. Thinking doesn't cost you anything. Impoundment paperwork costs both of us time. Another pause. Cole looked past her at the north fence, where the 6 Broken D cattle were grazing on his grass with the complete indifference of animals who do not follow property law. Coop, he said to the old man on the wagon bench, go get those cattle. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't surrender. But Coop drove the wagon toward the field without another word, and Charlotte turned back to the wagon, and Wyatt fell into step beside her, and Cole watched them go with an expression she couldn't read from behind. They were 50 feet away when Cole called after them. Mrs. Dawson. She stopped, but didn't turn fully. You're either very brave, he said, or very foolish. My husband said the same thing to me 3 weeks ago, Charlotte said. I'm still not sure which one he was right about. She heard something that might have been a laugh, short, dry, involuntary, before she started walking again. They were halfway home before Wyatt said anything. A water easement, he said. You'd give him access to the west water. A paid easement, Charlotte said. On terms we set. He gets access to the water. We keep full ownership of the land. He pays us an annual fee that more than covers the loan payments. She looked at him. It's not giving him anything, Wyatt. It's selling him the one piece of what he wants that doesn't cost us the thing he's really after. And if he doesn't take the deal, then he keeps coming at us, and we keep pushing back, and we document everything and hope the law holds. She paused. But I think he'll take it. He's a businessman. He's been fighting this war for 3 years because it was easier to take the land than buy the water. Now it's not easier anymore. Wyatt was quiet for a long stretch of road. You went to his property, he said, knowing what he'd done, knowing he wanted to humiliate us. Yes, and you made a deal offer instead of a fight. Fighting feels better, Charlotte said. Winning is better than both. He turned and looked at her, and she felt the weight of it again. That direct, uncomplicated, unperformed attention. The look of a man who has stopped trying to categorize what he is seeing and has simply decided to see it. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me. When I put that money down at the auction, he said carefully, I told myself I was doing it because I needed help on the ranch, because it was a practical decision. He paused. That was partly true. I know, Charlotte said, but it was also... He stopped. Tried again. When I saw you on that platform standing there the way you were standing, not giving the room what it wanted, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. He was looking at the road ahead now, not at her. Like maybe not everything that was worth something had already been taken. The wagon moved through the afternoon heat. Wyatt, Charlotte said quietly. You don't have to say anything. I know I don't. She was quiet for a moment. I came out here because I had nothing left and nowhere to go. That's true. But somewhere in the last 3 weeks, I stopped thinking about this place as the last option I had. She looked at him. I started thinking of it as the first thing that was mine. He turned to look at her. Ours, she said. The word sat between them on the wagon bench with a weight that was not heavy but permanent. The particular weight of something that has been said and cannot be unsaid and does not need to be. He reached across and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical ceremony of romance, but with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a decision he has already made and is simply now acting on. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they rode the rest of the way home, like that, without speaking. Cole's answer came 8 days later. It came in the form of a letter carefully worded in the dry language of business, agreeing in principle to the water easement arrangement and proposing a meeting with both parties and a lawyer present to discuss terms. Charlotte read it at the kitchen table and felt the particular feeling of a thing being true that you have been working toward long enough that the truth of it lands quietly without fanfare, like a key finally turning in a lock that has been stiff for a long time. She set the letter on the table. He said yes, Wyatt said. He was reading her face, not the letter. He said in principle, Charlotte said, which is a businessman's way of saying yes while leaving himself room to negotiate the details. But yes. Coop, who had been in the kitchen doorway with the studied casualness of a man who just happened to be standing there, let out a long breath through his nose. I'll be, he said. Charlotte folded the letter. We need a lawyer. Someone Cole hasn't already gotten to. There's a man in Red Fork, Wyatt said. Joseph Garrett. He handled Greaves's boarding house contracts. Pearl recommended him when I first took out the loan, but I couldn't afford him then. Can we afford him now? With the Red Fork income, yes, barely. He paused. But yes. Then write to him today, Charlotte said. We meet with Cole on our terms with Garrett in the room, and we don't sign anything until Garrett has read every word. She picked up the letter. Cole is smart. That means the details will be where he tries to take back what he's agreed to in principle. You don't trust him. I trust that he's consistent, Charlotte said. He wants the water rights. He's decided this is the most efficient way to get them. As long as that calculation holds, he'll behave. She set the letter on the pile of papers that had accumulated on the corner of the desk. Over the past 3 weeks, the ledger pages, the Red Fork contract, the county records, the loan agreement with her marginal notes, and looked at it for a moment. But I want Garrett in the room. I'll write today, Wyatt said. He sat down at the desk, and Charlotte moved toward the door, and then Wyatt said quietly, without looking up from the paper he was reaching for, "Charlotte." What happens after? She paused in his doorway. After the easement. After all of it. He set the pen down. After the loan is manageable, and Cole has his water rights, and the Red Fork contract is running. He looked up. What do you want from this? From here? It was the first time anyone had asked her that question, in longer than she could clearly remember. Not what she was capable of, not what she could contribute, what she wanted. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house that had become in 3 weeks more genuinely hers than anything she had possessed in years, and she thought about what the answer actually was underneath the practicalities and the plans and the arithmetic that had been running continuously in the back of her head since the day she stepped off the auction platform. "I want this to be real," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "It is real," he said. "I know," Charlotte said. "I mean, I want it to keep being real. The work, the land, the—" She stopped. Tried again. "I don't want to be temporary." He was very still. "You were never temporary," he said. "Not for one day." The morning light came through the window and lay across the desk and the papers and the man sitting at it, and Charlotte looked at all of it and felt the armor she had been wearing since she was 12 years old. The armor she had built plate by plate from every room that had laughed at her, every door that had shut before she reached it, every mirror that had offered back the wrong answer. She felt it do something it had never quite done before, not fall. She was not a woman who dropped her armor in a single dramatic moment. That was not who she was. But she felt it lighten, just slightly, the way a coat feels lighter in the first real morning of spring. "Write the letter," she said. "I'll start on the garden." She went outside. She was 3 rows into the planting when she heard the wagon coming up the road. She straightened up and shaded her eyes and looked. And what she saw was not a wagon she recognized. Not Pearl's, not the Red Fork delivery, not Coop's old flatbed. It was a newer vehicle, well-maintained with a single driver, who handled the reins with the clipped efficiency of someone running an errand rather than paying a visit. The wagon pulled up at the gate. The driver was a young man, maybe 20, with Cole's ranch brand on his jacket. He looked at Charlotte with the blank professionalism of a messenger. "Mrs. Dawson," he said. "Yes." He reached into the seat beside him and produced a sealed envelope. "From Mr. Cole. He said it was time-sensitive." Charlotte walked to the gate and took it without a word, and the young man turned the wagon and drove back the way he'd come. She broke the seal and read the letter standing there at the gate with the late morning sun on her face, and the garden dirt on her gloves, and the sound of Wyatt's pen moving in the house behind her. It was not the letter she had been expecting. It was not about the water easement. It was about the auction. Cole had found out. She didn't know how. Didn't know which set of ears in Dust Creek had sold them the information that the original auction contract, the one signed by Charlotte and witnessed by Pruitt, had not been properly registered with the county clerk within the required 7-day window. Pruitt apparently had been 7 days late filing it, which meant, according to Cole's lawyer, that the marriage contract was technically unenforceable under Montana territorial law, which meant that Wyatt Dawson had no legal wife, which meant that the property co-ownership claim Charlotte had been implicitly relying on, the one that would have complicated any forced sale, did not legally exist. Charlotte stood at the gate and read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its crease and held it at her side, and stood still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, letting the shape of what Cole had just done settle fully into her understanding before she decided what to do with it. He was telling her she wasn't real, that everything she had built in 3 weeks, the contracts, the repairs, the easement negotiation, the $12 turned into 43, turned into a future that all of it rested on a legal foundation that did not exist. He was telling her she was still the woman on the platform, still the woman nobody wanted, still temporary. She breathed in slowly through her nose. Then she walked back into the house. Wyatt looked up from the desk when she came in. He read her face immediately. She could see the shift in his, the sudden sharpening, and he put the pen down. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. Watched the stillness come over him, the same stillness as when he'd read the bank letter, but deeper this time, a stillness that had something under it that she recognized as a man who is fighting very hard not to show exactly how afraid he is. He set the letter on the desk. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "This doesn't change Wyatt." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I know what this doesn't change. I need you to tell me, do you want to fix it?" He stared at her. "What do you mean, do I want to?" "I mean," Charlotte said with perfect precision, "that we are currently operating on a contract that does not legally exist, and there are two options. We challenge the registration timing in court, which will take months we don't have, or—" She stopped. "Or we make it legal, properly, before Cole can use this in the easement negotiation." The room was very quiet. "Are you asking me," Wyatt said slowly, "to marry you?" "I'm telling you," Charlotte said, "that it would solve the legal problem." Charlotte. "And," she said, and her voice did something then, not breaking, not wavering, but shifting into something slightly less armored than everything she had said in the previous 3 weeks. "I am telling you that it is also what I want, if you want it too." Wyatt stood up from the desk. I was across the room in 3 steps, and he took both her hands in his, the one still wearing his mother's gloves, and he looked at her, the way he had looked at her on the wagon bench when she said the word ours, with that steady, open, unperformed certainty. "There isn't a thing I want more," he said. She let out a breath that had been building for a long time. "We need to be in front of a judge before Cole files anything with the county," she said. "Tomorrow morning," Wyatt said. "Garrett can do both, witness the marriage and start the easement paperwork." "Pearl will want to be there," Charlotte said. "She will," he agreed. "She'll probably cry. She absolutely will, and she'll deny it until she dies." Something had happened to his face, the careful, held-back quality that she had come to think of as simply the way he was had opened slightly, and what was underneath it was something she recognized with the full conviction of a woman who has been waiting her whole life to see it directed at her without condition or qualification. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she said back. "You saved this ranch," he said. "We saved it," Charlotte said. He raised one of her hands, the gloved one, his mother's glove, and pressed it briefly against his jaw, and closed his eyes for just a moment, and she felt the whole weight of the 3 years he had spent fighting alone pass through that one gesture, like water through a crack in stone. Then he opened his eyes and let her hand go, and said, "I'll ride to Red Fork and find Garrett today." "I'll write to Pearl," Charlotte said. He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Charlotte." "Wyatt?" "For what it's worth," he said. "I would have wanted it without the legal problem." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "So would I." He went out. She heard his boots on the porch steps, the sound of the horse being readied, the particular rhythm of a man moving with purpose instead of against something. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the letter from Cole still lying on the desk. He had sent it thinking it was a weapon. He had handed her the last piece she needed. She picked up her pen. Wyatt rode to Red Fork and back in one day, which meant he pushed the horse harder than he should have and came home after dark with dust on every surface of him, and a signed appointment with Joseph Garrett for 9 o'clock the following morning. Charlotte had supper waiting. She did not say anything about the horse, or the dust, or the hour. She put the plate in front of him and sat across the table and waited while he ate, and when he was halfway through, he looked up and said, "Garrett can do both. Marriage witness and easement contract initiation, same morning." "Good," Charlotte said. He also said, Wyatt set his fork down. He said the registration timing issue is real. Pruitt filed late. It's documented. "I know. Cole could use it to block any property claim you might have in a forced sale proceeding." I know that too." "Charlotte." He looked at her directly. "I need you to understand something before tomorrow. This isn't— I don't want you to think that tomorrow is only about solving Cole's legal move." "I don't think that," she said. "I need to say it anyway." He pushed the plate slightly to the side, the gesture of a man clearing space to say something that matters. "When I put that money down at the auction, I didn't know you. I knew what I saw in 30 seconds, which was a woman who wouldn't give a cruel room what it wanted. That was enough for me to act." He paused. "But what I know now after 5 weeks is a different thing entirely. And I need you to know that tomorrow is about that, not about Cole." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "But Wyatt, it's also about Cole. Both things can be true at the same time." Something in him relaxed slightly, like he'd been braced for her to be more complicated about it than she was. "Yeah," he said. "They can." "Eat your supper," she said. "We leave at first light." Pearl arrived at 6 in the morning, which was 45 minutes before anyone had asked her to, and exactly when Charlotte had privately expected her. She came with her good hat and a covered dish of something that smelled like it had been baking since before dawn, and she walked into the kitchen and set the dish on the counter and looked Charlotte over with the particular scrutiny of a woman who has decided she is responsible for an outcome and wants to confirm everything is proceeding correctly. "You look tired," Pearl said. "I'm fine," Charlotte said. "You didn't sleep." "I slept some." Pearl took off her riding gloves and set them on the counter next to the dish. "Cole's going to find out before noon," she said. "Word travels in this county." "I know." "Are you ready for what he does when he finds out?" Charlotte looked at her. "What do you think he does?" "I think he tries to file something with the county clerk before Garrett can register the marriage," Pearl said. "To establish the legal ambiguity before you can resolve it." She paused. "He has friends at the clerk's office." Charlotte had not thought of that specifically. She thought of it now, quickly and completely running the sequence forward, the way she ran numbers, action consequence, counter consequence of counter. "How long does filing take?" she said. "With the right clerk, 20 minutes, without 2 hours minimum." "Which clerk is Cole's friend?" "Briggs. He comes in at 8. Charlotte looked at the clock on the wall. It was 6:14. "Then we need to be at the county office before 8, she said. Pearl raised one eyebrow. "I thought the appointment with Garrett was at 9. "It is, but the county clerk's office is 2 blocks from Garrett's. We file the marriage certificate first before Briggs arrives, and then we go to Garrett." She turned toward the hallway. "Wyatt." His boots were already on the stairs. "I heard," he said. "Can we make it?" "If we leave now." Pearl picked up her gloves. "I'll drive my own buggy. Keep up if you can." They made it to the county office at 7:41. The clerk on duty was a young woman named Agnes, who had the slightly startled expression of someone who did not typically handle marriage registrations before 8 in the morning on a Wednesday, but who processed the paperwork with efficient goodwill once Charlotte set it in front of her with every line already filled in and the correct fee counted out in exact coins on the counter. Agnes stamped the certificate at 7:53. At 8:02. Charlotte watched through the front window of the clerk's office as a man who matched Pearl's description of Briggs came down the street, turned in at the office entrance, and stopped when he saw Charlotte standing at the front counter with a stamped marriage certificate in her hand, and Pearl Hartley standing 2 feet to her left with the expression of a woman who has been looking forward to this specific moment for a considerable amount of time. Briggs looked at the certificate. He looked at Charlotte. He looked at Pearl. He turned around and walked back out. "He'll go straight to Cole," Pearl said. "I know," Charlotte said. "Let him." Wyatt, who had been waiting near the door, looked at Charlotte with something that was trying not to be a smile and not entirely succeeding. "Agnes," he said to the young clerk, "thank you for your time." Agnes looked between all of them with the expression of someone who understood that something significant had just happened in her office but was not entirely sure what. "Congratulations," she said uncertainly. "Thank you," Charlotte said. She folded the certificate carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest. "Now we go see Garrett." Joseph Garrett was a trim, sharp-eyed man of about 45 who had the manner of someone who had spent long enough in frontier law to be impressed by very little and prepared for almost everything. He shook Charlotte's hand when Wyatt introduced her, looked at her for approximately 2 seconds with the evaluating attention of a professional, and then said, "You're the one who found the conflict of interest in Fletcher's appointment." "Pearl told him," Wyatt said. "Pearl tells me most things worth knowing in this county," Garrett said without any particular inflection. Sit down. Show me the coal letter and the loan agreement. Let's see what we're actually working with. Charlotte spread the documents on his desk and walked him through them in order: the original loan terms, the assessment clause, the county record on Fletcher, the coal letter, about the registration timing, and finally, the water easement proposal she had outlined in her response to Cole's first visit. Garrett listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. He read everything she said in front of him with the focused clause-by-clause attention of a man for whom documents were a language he read more fluently than English. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You negotiated the easement proposal yourself," he said. "Yes." "Without legal training?" "Without formal legal training," Charlotte said. "I read extensively." Garrett looked at Wyatt. "Where did you find her?" "Auction," Wyatt said. Garrett absorbed this without comment and turned back to Charlotte. "The easement terms you proposed are sound. The pricing structure is slightly below what I would have suggested, but not indefensibly, so Cole might actually accept it faster because of that which has its own value." He tapped the Cole letter. "The registration issue is real, but moot now that you've filed. If he tries to challenge the timing in court, the burden of proof falls on him to demonstrate material damage, and with a same-day filing, he won't establish it." He paused. "What Cole is going to do next is apply pressure on the easement negotiation. He'll use the 6-week loan payment as leverage, try to rush you into signing unfavorable terms because you need the cash." "When is our next payment due?" Charlotte asked Wyatt. 3 weeks, he said. "And our current reserve, $21. Garrett looked at both of them. "The payment is $52. "I know," Charlotte said. "Which means we need the easement signed and the first payment issued within 3 weeks, or we negotiate a temporary extension on the loan which Cole controls and almost certainly won't grant voluntarily." She looked at Garrett. "What's the fastest you can get the easement contract drafted and ready for signature?" Garrett considered. 4 days for a clean draft, 2 more for review. If Cole's lawyer is cooperative, you could be signing by end of next week." "Cole's lawyer won't be cooperative," Charlotte said. "No," Garrett agreed. "He won't. Plan for 10 days, and we'll fight for 7. "Then we need a backup," Charlotte said. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "What kind of backup?" "The Red Fork contract," Charlotte said. "We have a signed 2-year agreement with Greaves." "What's the standard commercial practice for advance payment against a signed supply contract?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Some buyers will advance against a signed contract if the seller has demonstrated reliability." "We've made 2 deliveries on schedule," Charlotte said. "Greaves was satisfied both times. If we approach him for a partial advance against the next 60 days of contract value..." "It's possible," Garrett said slowly. "It's not standard. But Greaves is a practical man, and he values his supply relationship." He paused. "You'd need to go to Red Fork and ask him directly." "When can you have a preliminary draft of the easement ready?" Charlotte said. "Something I can show Cole as evidence the process is moving so he doesn't make another aggressive move while we're waiting for the final version." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. 2 days, he said. "Good," Charlotte said. "We'll go to Red Fork on day 3. There was a pause in the room. Then Earl, who had been sitting in the corner chair with the covered dish on her lap, and the expression of someone watching a performance she had anticipated and is not disappointed by, said, "Are you going to tell her she should have been a lawyer, or shall I?" "She already knows," Garrett said dryly. Charlotte picked up her pen. "What do you need from us to start the draft?" The next 2 days were the kind of days that compress time every hour, carrying the weight of 3 every task completed, revealing 2 more that needed doing the ranch work, and the legal preparation running simultaneously in a way that left no space for anything except the next necessary thing. Cole sent a letter on the 2nd day. It was shorter than his previous communications and considerably less polished, which told Charlotte that he had written it himself rather than through his lawyer, which told her that something had unsettled him enough to bypass the professional intermediary. The letter said that he had reconsidered the easement proposal and was prepared to move forward with the meeting, but that he required the meeting to take place within 5 days and that he would be bringing his own contract draft rather than working from theirs. Charlotte read it at the kitchen table with Wyatt across from her and Coop leaning in the doorway. "He's rattled," Coop said. "He's moving fast," Charlotte said. "Which is what I wanted, but it means he's also bringing his own terms, which means we'll be negotiating against a document designed to favor him." She tapped the letter against the table once. "Garrett needs to see this today." "I'll ride," Wyatt said. "No." Charlotte stood up. "We ride together. I need to be in the room when Garrett reads it." Coop looked at the space where both of them had been sitting. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "when Wyatt first brought her home, I gave it a week." No one answered him because no one was there to answer. The front door had already closed. Garrett read the letter, set it down and said, "He's going to lowball the annual payment rate." "How low?" Charlotte said. "As low as he thinks you'll accept given the loan pressure. My guess is he opens at $40 annually." Charlotte had run the numbers on the water rights 3 separate times from 3 different angles. "The minimum we need to service the loan comfortably is $95, she said. "The fair market value of the access rights is somewhere between $110 and $130, depending on how wet the next 2 years are." "He'll know that," Garrett said. "He's been in this business for 20 years. So he'll open at 40, expecting me to counter at 90, and he'll land us somewhere around 70, which still doesn't cover the payment cycle cleanly." "That's my assessment," Garrett said. "Then we don't open at 90, Charlotte said. Garrett looked at her. "What do you open at?" "150, Charlotte said. "Annual payment indexed to rainfall data from the county agricultural records. In wet years we get more. In dry years the rate adjusts proportionally." She paused. "It's not punitive, it's accurate. And it reframes the negotiation entirely. Instead of fighting over a fixed number, we're discussing a methodology which takes the conversation somewhere Cole's lawyer hasn't prepared for." Garrett was quiet. Then he uncapped his pen. "Walk me through the rainfall indexing." She did. When she finished, Garrett had 4 pages of notes, a revised draft framework, and the expression of a man who has encountered something that has genuinely surprised him. "One question," he said. "Ask." "Why didn't you just let him have the land?" Garrett said. 6 weeks ago, from where you were standing, you could have walked away, taken whatever he offered, started over somewhere else." Charlotte looked at him. "Because he was counting on that," she said. "He was counting on us being tired and frightened and alone. And I'm not tired, and I'm not frightened, and I'm not alone anymore." She said it simply without emphasis, the way people state things they have decided are facts rather than feelings. Garrett nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's build your contract." They met Cole 4 days later in Garrett's office. Cole brought his lawyer, a compact, humorless man named Driscoll, who carried his briefcase with the air of a weapon, and his draft contract, which was 22 pages, and opened with an annual payment offer of $45. Charlotte had read Garrett's draft until she could recite sections of it from memory. Driscoll presented Cole's terms in the flat, rapid cadence of a man who has delivered documents like this many times, and considers the presentation of them to be the conclusion of the process rather than the beginning. When he finished, the room was quiet. Cole was watching Charlotte. Charlotte picked up her copy of Cole's draft, turned to page 7 and said, "Section 3, subsection 2. You've defined water access as unlimited draw during daylight hours, which at current cattle counts on your north property is approximately 400 gallons per day." She set the page down. "The west water source on the Broken D produces a reliable 600 gallons per day in dry conditions and considerably more in wet. 400 gallons represents 2/3 of our dry season capacity, which would compromise our own cattle operation during drought periods." She looked at Driscoll. "We can offer a draw limit of 250 gallons per day in dry season, indexed upward to 400 in wet season, at a rate of $110 annually payment in advance each spring." Driscoll blinked. "That's considerably above." "It's consistent with the County Agricultural Office's published rate guide for water access easements, which Garrett has here," Charlotte said without inflecting it as an argument. "Just as information." Garrett placed the guide on the table. Cole had not looked at Driscoll during any of this. He had been looking at Charlotte with the careful, fully attentive expression of a man who has stopped performing and started actually thinking. 110 is aggressive, Cole said. 110 is correct, Charlotte said. We can discuss the draw limits. We are not negotiating the rate basis. A silence. Driscoll looked at Cole. Cole did not look at Driscoll. The draw limit is workable, Cole said. At 110 I need payment quarterly rather than in advance annually. Semi-annual, Charlotte said. Spring and fall, advance. Quarterly, Cole said. 60 days post-period. Semi-annual 30 days post-period, Charlotte said. And we include a right of first refusal clause if you sell the Cole property. The easement terms are renegotiated with the new owner rather than transferred automatically. Cole's eyes narrowed slightly. That's unusual. It protects us from inheriting a relationship with an unknown party, Charlotte said. You'd want the same protection in our position. A pause that stretched long enough to breathe twice. Semi-annual 30 days right of first refusal, Cole said. At 105. Charlotte looked at Garrett. Garrett gave one small, nearly invisible nod. 105, Charlotte said. With a minimum 3-year term and review at the end of each term. Cole held out his hand across the table. She shook it. And just like that, in the flat, practical, undramatic way of business conducted between people who have stopped pretending to be other than what they are, the war was over. Choto. Driscoll gathered his papers with the specific economy of a man who knows better than to editorialize on outcomes he was not expecting. Cole stood and straightened his jacket and looked at Charlotte with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something she could only describe as honest. You've done well here, he said. It was not effusive. It was not performed. It was the exact measured acknowledgement of one competent person to another. We've done what we needed to, Charlotte said. Cole glanced at Wyatt, then back at her. I underestimated the situation, he said. I don't do that often. I know, Charlotte said. He put his hat on and walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame, the same way Wyatt stopped. Sometimes she noticed that particular pause of a man with one more thing to say. That auction, he said without turning around. I was in the room. Charlotte said nothing. I didn't bid, Cole said. I watched the room laugh, and I didn't bid. He paused. That was a failure of judgment on my part. Not just the tactical kind. He turned his head slightly, not quite far enough to see her fully. I wanted you to know I understand the difference. He went out. Driscoll followed him without making eye contact with anyone. The door closed. Garrett sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. Well, he said. Well? Pearl agreed from the corner where she had been sitting with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been patient for a very long time. Wyatt had not moved from the wall where he'd been standing throughout the negotiation, present and quiet. And he moved now, not dramatically, not with the theatrical emphasis of a scene in a play, just to Charlotte's side, and he put his hand against the small of her back, a touch so natural and unhurried that it might have been something he had been doing for years. 105, he said quietly just to her. It'll cover the loan payment and leave us $11, she said. Every 6 months. Every 6 months, she confirmed. Recurring. He was quiet for a moment. So we're going to be all right. Charlotte looked at the signed contract on Garrett's desk. Yes, she said. We're going to be all right. She said it simply, the way she said most important things, without reaching for emphasis or drama. But she felt it go through her as she said it, through the armor that had lightened in the kitchen, and was lighter still now, through the part of her that had spent 3 years making herself small enough to fit in whatever space was offered, through everything she had believed about herself in every room that had looked at her and found her lacking. They were going to be all right. Not because everything had been easy, because nothing had been easy, and they had done it anyway. On the ride back to the Broken D, the afternoon already going gold and long. Charlotte sat beside Wyatt on the wagon bench and said nothing for a long time. Coop had ridden ahead. Pearl had gone home with the satisfied air of a woman whose work here was done. The road back was familiar now, in the way things become familiar when you have traveled them enough times in enough different emotional conditions, the particular tree at the bend. The place where the creek came close to the road, and you could hear it before you saw it, the long rise before the property came into view. "There's something I have to tell you," Wyatt said. Charlotte looked at him. His voice had the specific quality of something that had been held a long time and was being let go carefully. "Tell me," she said. "When I went to the auction," he said, "I wasn't planning to bid on anyone." She waited. "I went because Coop told me there might be women from back east who understood business and bookkeeping, and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that I might talk to someone, ask questions, maybe get some advice on the accounts from someone who'd come from a different kind of operation." He paused. "I had the $2 in my pocket for a drink." Charlotte looked at him. "And then you were standing up there," he said, "and the room was doing what it was doing, and He stopped. "I want to be honest about this. The first thing I felt was angry. Not sorry for you. Angry. At the room. For thinking that what they were seeing was all there was." He looked at the road. "And then I thought, if I'm angry at this room, why am I still standing in the back of it?" The wagon moved through the afternoon light. "So you spent your drink money," Charlotte said. "I spent my drink money," Wyatt said. She turned that over for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "About Clara." He glanced at her. "About how you knew she looked away, and you ignored it," Charlotte said. "I want to ask you something about that, and I want you to answer honestly." "Ask." "When you look at me," Charlotte said carefully, "what do you see? Not who you need me to be for the ranch, or the loan, or the legal situation. What do you actually see?" The wagon went over a rise, and the broken D came into view below them, the repaired fence, the straight rows of the garden, the barn with its new roof boards, the house with its painted front face and its 2 good windows. Wyatt looked at it for a moment, then at her. "I see someone who stood up on a platform in front of a room that wanted to break her," he said, "and didn't break." He paused. "And who has spent every day since then doing the same thing in every room she's walked into without making it seem like it costs her anything." He held her gaze. "I see that it costs you something. I want you to know that." Charlotte was quiet. "It does," she said finally. "But less than it used to." "Good," he said. "I'd like it to cost you less and less." The horses pulled them down the rise toward home. "I want to ask you something too," Wyatt said. "Ask." "The armor," he said. "The thing you wear. The chin-up, eyes forward, give them nothing version of you." He paused. "Does it ever come down, just all the way down? Not managed, not strategic, just down?" Charlotte was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally. "I haven't found out yet." "Will you let me be there when you do?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded as if that settled something and turned back to the road. They pulled up to the house as the sun was hitting the far edge of the property, and Coop was already in the barn, doing the evening feeding, and the kitchen garden was throwing long shadows across the yard. And the broken D looked in this particular light exactly like what it had always had the potential to be, and what it was only now finally becoming. Charlotte climbed down from the wagon before Wyatt could come around to help, because she was that kind of woman, and always would be. And she stood in the yard, looking at the property for a moment, with her hands at her sides, and the signed easement contract in the inside pocket of her jacket. She heard a horse coming up the road. Fast. Too fast for a social call. She turned. Wyatt had heard it too, and was already still watching the road. The rider came over the rise at a gallop, and pulled up hard at the gate. A young man, not Cole's messenger. This time, someone she didn't recognize, with the wide, pressured expression of someone carrying urgent news. "Mr. Dawson," he said, breathing hard. "I ride for the county courthouse. There's been a filing." Wyatt stepped forward. "What kind of filing?" "Ownership challenge," the young man said. "Filed an hour ago. Against the Broken D property." He looked between them. "It's not Cole." Charlotte went very still. "Then who?" Wyatt said. The rider looked down at the paper in his hand. "A woman named Clara Whitfield," he said. "Previously Clara Hawes." She says she has a prior claim on this property based on a verbal agreement made in 1874. He looked up. She says she was promised co-ownership of the broken D as part of an engagement agreement. She's filed for an injunction against any transfer of ownership or easement registration until the claim is resolved. The yard went completely silent. Wyatt had gone the color of old ash. Charlotte looked at him. She said nothing. She waited. Because she had learned in the course of 5 weeks of living beside this man that the difference between a person worth trusting and a person who only seemed worth trusting was exactly what they did in the moments they had not prepared for. Wyatt turned and looked at her, and his face, which had gone through shock and gone through something else, something she read as not guilt, but the specific horror of a thing from the past, arriving uninvited in the middle of the present. His face settled into the same expression it had worn on the auction platform. Certain, unhurried, clear. "I never made that promise," he said. "Not in writing, not by a lawyer, not in front of witnesses." He held her gaze. "But we're going to need Garrett again." Charlotte breathed in slowly. "First thing tomorrow," she said. She went inside and started supper, and the fact that her hands were steady the whole time was a thing she noticed and held onto like a coin in a coat pocket, small and solid, and entirely hers. Garrett's office felt smaller the second time. Charlotte noticed it when they walked in the next morning. The same desk, the same shelves, the same careful man behind the same stacks of documents. But the air in the room had a different quality. Now the kind of compressed, close feeling that spaces get when what's being discussed inside them has real weight. She had not slept much. She was honest with herself about that. She had lain in the dark and listened to Wyatt's even breathing from the other side of the wall, and thought about a woman named Clara Whitfield, previously, Clara Hawes, who had written a letter to a man in 1875, saying she didn't think she could build a life on land that was fighting her at every turn, and who had apparently spent the intervening years changing her mind. The question was not whether Wyatt had made the promise. Charlotte believed him when he said he hadn't. She believed it not because she needed to believe it, not because love had made her credulous, but because she had spent 5 weeks reading this man, the way she read ledger books line by line, looking for the place where the numbers stopped adding up, and she had not found one yet. The question was what Clara thought she could prove. Garrett had the filing in front of him when they sat down. He had clearly been reading it for some time before they arrived, because his notes in the margin were already dense, and his expression was the specific one of a lawyer who has found something that concerns him, and is deciding how to present that concern without alarming the people who need to remain functional. "Tell me," Charlotte said. Garrett set down his pen. "The claim is based on 3 things. A letter from Wyatt dated March 1874 in which he references their future together on the Broken D property. Testimony from 2 witnesses in Colorado who say they heard Wyatt describe the property as Clara's future home, and a receipt showing that Clara contributed $60 toward the original property purchase." The room was very quiet. Charlotte looked at Wyatt. His jaw was set. "The letter was real," he said. "I wrote it. I used those words." He paused. "We were engaged. I was talking about our future together. I wasn't making a legal agreement." "The $60, Charlotte said. "I didn't know about that," he said. Garrett picked up the filing. "Her lawyer, she's using a man named Holt out of Denver, which tells us she's been planning this for some time and has resources behind her. Holt is arguing that the letter, the witnesses, and the money together constitute a verbal contract with partial performance, which is a legally recognized instrument in Montana territory under certain conditions." "What conditions?" Charlotte said. "The party making the claim must have acted in reliance on the promise and suffered demonstrable loss when it wasn't fulfilled." Garrett looked at the filing. "Holt argues that Clara gave up other marriage prospects in reliance on Wyatt's promise, and that the $60 represents financial loss." "She left him," Charlotte said. "She wrote a letter and ended the engagement. How does someone who terminates an agreement then claim damages from it? That," Garrett said, "is our strongest argument. The doctrine of unclean hands. She can't claim breach of an agreement she herself abandoned." He paused. "But Holt will argue that she left because Wyatt failed to maintain the property to the standard he'd represented, which constitutes prior breach on Wyatt's part. Charlotte looked at the filing. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at every document Cole had ever sent, not for what it said on the surface, but for what it was actually trying to accomplish underneath. "This isn't about the property," she said. Garrett glanced at her. "Clara doesn't want the broken D," Charlotte said. "She's married to a lawyer in Denver. She has a different life. She's not going to move to a ranch in Montana." She tapped the filing. "This is about the $60, maybe about the letter, maybe about something else entirely." She looked at Wyatt. "When did you last have any contact with her?" "She wrote me once," Wyatt said. "About 2 years ago. Just a letter. She said she'd heard things were difficult on the property, and she hoped I was managing." "Did you write back?" "No." "Did she write again?" "No." Charlotte thought about a woman in Denver with a comfortable life, writing a letter to an ex-fiancé on a failing Montana ranch and getting no response. She thought about what that woman might have wanted from the letter and not gotten. "Holt filed in the county courthouse," she said. "Not in Denver, not in the territorial capital. Here." "He'd have to file locally," Garrett said. "The property is here." "But he could have sent a demand letter first," Charlotte said. "A formal legal demand for the $60 with interest. That's the standard approach if it's genuinely about financial recovery." She looked at Garrett. "He didn't do that. He went straight to an ownership claim." "Why?" Garrett was looking at her with a very specific expression, the one she had started to recognize as his version of respect. "Because someone told him it would work," he said slowly. "Because someone told him we were vulnerable right now," Charlotte said. "After the easement negotiation, right at the end of the loan pressure period, when they expected us to be too tired and too financially stretched to fight another front." "Cole," Wyatt said, flat and certain. "Or someone working the same information Cole had," Charlotte said. "I don't know that it was Cole specifically, but this filing came the same day we signed the easement. Someone was watching the courthouse." Garrett leaned back in his chair. "If Cole is behind this, he's being considerably more sophisticated than I gave him credit for." "He lost the direct approach," Charlotte said. "He's trying the indirect one." She looked at Garrett. "Can we depose Clara?" "We can request it," Garrett said. "She'd have to come to Montana to give testimony, which is a significant ask. If she refuses it, weakens Holt's case considerably. A claimant who won't show up to support her own claim raises credibility questions." "Request it today," Charlotte said. "And I want to see the letter, the one from 1874. Garrett looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said, "I'll write it out as best I remember it. I don't have the original." "Holt does," Charlotte said. "Which means we need to request discovery on all documents supporting the claim, and I want to see the witnesses' full statements, not just the summary in the filing." She looked at Garrett. "Can you have that requested by end of day?" "Yes," Garrett said. "And I want to know who paid Holt's retainer," Charlotte said. "Is that discoverable?" Garrett paused. "Under certain circumstances, attorney fee arrangements are considered privileged, but if we can establish a third-party interest in the litigation outcome." He stopped. "That's a creative argument." "But possible." "Possible," he said. "Difficult. Start with the deposition request and discovery," Charlotte said. "The fee arrangement we pursue if the first two give us enough to establish third-party involvement." She stood up. "How long do we have before the injunction affects the easement registration?" "The injunction Holt filed is preliminary," Garrett said. "It freezes ownership transfers, but the easement is already signed and notarized. Whether it falls under the freeze depends on how the judge interprets the scope." He looked at his notes. "We have a hearing in 8 days." 8 days. Charlotte did the arithmetic she had been doing since the rider came up the road last evening. 8 days to the hearing. 3 weeks to the loan payment. The easement's first payment wasn't due until spring. "What do we need to win the hearing?" she said. "Evidence that the claim lacks legal merit," Garrett said. "The best evidence would be Clara's own testimony in person, which I suspect will not support what Holt has represented. People's stories tend to shift when they're under oath and being cross-examined by someone who has read their letters." "Then we need her here," Charlotte said. "She's in Denver," Wyatt said. Charlotte looked at him. Do you have an address? Howe was quiet for a moment. Her family's address. I don't know if she's still there. Write it down, Charlotte said. I need to send a letter today. Wyatt looked at her. You're going to write to Clara. I'm going to invite her to come tell the truth, Charlotte said. In person, under oath. Because I think she wants to, and I think someone has been using her, and I think she probably knows it by now, and doesn't know how to get out of the arrangement she's gotten into. She held Wyatt's gaze. I could be wrong, but I'd rather try this than spend 8 days hoping she refuses the deposition and hoping that's enough. Wyatt was very still. Charlotte, he said, I know what you're going to say. You're going to write to the woman I was engaged to, he said, carefully, about a legal claim against our property, to ask her to come testify in our defense. Yes. That doesn't bother you. Charlotte picked up her bag. What bothers me, she said, is losing the broken D over a $60 receipt and 2 witnesses in Colorado. Clara Whitfield is a person who made a decision 4 years ago that she may or may not regret, and someone has apparently convinced her that this filing was a reasonable response to that regret. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to give her the chance to be better than whatever that person told her she needed to be. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. You are the most remarkable person I have ever met, he said. Write me the address, Charlotte said. We need to post the letter before noon. She wrote it herself at Garrett's desk, while Wyatt and Garrett worked on the discovery request in the outer office. It took her 4 drafts to get it right. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she was being careful. Careful to be honest without being cruel. Clear without being cold, direct, without giving Holt anything he could use if the letter ended up as evidence. The final version was 1 page. It said that Charlotte was writing as Wyatt's wife and the cooperator of the broken D. It said that she understood Clara had filed a claim, and that Charlotte was not writing to dispute that right, but to ask that Clara consider coming to Montana to give her testimony in person, rather than through a representative, because Charlotte believed that Clara's own account of events would be more complete and more honest than what a filing prepared by someone else could convey. It said that whatever had passed between Clara and Wyatt 4 years ago was not Charlotte's business, and that she bore no ill feeling toward Clara as a person. It said that there were people with financial interests in the outcome of this filing who were not Clara, and that Charlotte thought Clara was probably aware of that by now and might be finding it uncomfortable. It said, I think you're a person who knows the difference between what you want and what someone else wants you to want. I'm asking you to trust that. She sealed it and addressed it to the Hawes family address and put it in Garrett's outgoing mail before she could second-guess herself. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and breathed. The next 8 days were the longest of Charlotte's time in Montana. The easement registration was delayed pending the hearing, which meant the first payment from Cole was also delayed, which meant the loan payment was in question again, which meant she was doing arithmetic in her head every morning at 5 o'clock in the kitchen, while the coffee heated and the ranch woke up around her. Coop knew something was wrong. He didn't ask. He simply showed up earlier every day and worked later and said less than usual, which was his version of support, and Charlotte had learned to receive it as such. Pearl came twice. The first time she brought food and information she had heard through channels. Charlotte didn't ask about that Holt had been contacted first by an intermediary, not by Clara directly, which confirmed at least part of Charlotte's theory about the arrangement. The second time she came alone in the evening and sat at the kitchen table after Wyatt had gone out to the barn and looked at Charlotte with the particular directness of a woman who has decided a conversation needs to happen. How are you actually doing? Pearl said. Charlotte considered giving the functional answer. Then she looked at Pearl at the woman who had knelt in the dirt in her good skirt to show her how to set a fence post right, who had kept county records for 3 years, waiting for someone who could use them, and she gave the real one instead. I keep thinking about what I'll do if we lose the hearing, she said. Not because I think we will, but because I've learned that thinking through the worst outcome makes me less afraid of it. She paused. And I'm trying to figure out if that's wisdom or if it's just a habit I built because nobody ever let me expect good things for very long. Pearl was quiet. It's both, she said finally. And neither one is wrong. Charlotte looked at her hands. The hands that wore Wyatt's mother's gloves when she worked, that had written 4 drafts of a letter to her husband's former fiancé, that had counted out exact coins on Gerald Pruitt's table, and balanced a ledger book that 2 months ago had nothing but loss in it. I'm not afraid of failing, Charlotte said. I've failed before and survived it. What I'm afraid of is... She stopped. Say it, Pearl said. I'm afraid that this turns out to be one more thing that almost happened, Charlotte said. One more almost. And I have to pick up and start over somewhere else and be practical about it and be fine. She looked up. I'm so tired of being fine. Pearl reached across the table and put her hand over Charlotte's. You are not an almost, Pearl said with the flat, authoritative certainty of a woman who has decided something and sees no reason to soften it. You hear me. What you've built here in 2 months, what you've done for this property, for that man, for this whole foolish county, you are not an almost. You are the thing that actually happened. Charlotte did not cry. She was not going to cry. But she held Pearl's hand very tightly for a moment, and then let go and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was almost entirely steady. Now, Pearl said, picking up her coffee, tell me what we still need before the hearing. Clara's reply arrived on the 6th day. Charlotte was in the garden when Wyatt brought it out. She saw his face before she saw the letter, and she stood up and took it from him without a word, and broke the seal and read it standing there with the dirt on her gloves and the afternoon heat pressing down. It was short. It said, I'll come. I arrive Thursday on the afternoon stage. I want to talk to you before the hearing. Not your lawyer. You. Charlotte read it twice. Then she handed it to Wyatt and watched his face go through several things in the space of a few seconds. Few seconds surprise and something complicated that wasn't quite guilt, and then a careful, deliberate settling into something steadier. She's coming, he said. She's coming, Charlotte confirmed. She wants to talk to you alone. I know. He looked at her. Charlotte. I'll talk to her, Charlotte said. Whatever she needs to say, I can hear it. She pulled off one glove and then the other. What I need you to do is trust me to handle it. He looked at her for a long moment with that steady, open expression that still 6 weeks in had the power to move something in her chest. I trust you, he said. It was the simplest possible thing to say, and he said it like he meant every syllable of it. Good, she said. Get Coop to cover the morning feeding on Thursday. I'll meet the stage. Clara Whitfield was not what Charlotte had imagined. She had built a picture from the facts available, a woman who wrote a letter, choosing comfort over commitment, who had a lawyer husband in Denver and a family address that had remained stable for 4 years, and the picture had been softer than the reality. Clara was 32, with sharp dark eyes and a composed, intelligent face, and the particular posture of a woman who has learned to take up exactly as much space as is permitted and no more. She carried one bag. She stepped off the stage and looked around Dust Creek with the expression of someone seeing a place they used to know translated into a version they weren't expecting, and then she saw Charlotte and went still. Charlotte had the wagon. She walked to the stage and said, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Charlotte Dawson. She held out her hand. Clara looked at the hand, at Charlotte, and then she shook it firmly without performance. I know who you are, Clara said. You're not what I expected. Nobody ever is, Charlotte said. Are you hungry? The drive to Garrett's office is 20 minutes. They did not go to Garrett's office. Charlotte drove to the creek instead, the near edge of the Broken D property, where the water ran over the flat stones, and the afternoon light came through at an angle that made the whole world look temporarily gentle. And they sat on the wagon bench, and Clara looked at the water, and Charlotte waited. Holt contacted my husband first, Clara said. Thomas. He said there was a financial recovery opportunity related to a property in Montana, historical claim, $60 plus interest, and if we wanted to pursue it, Holt would handle it on contingency. Who contacted Holt? Charlotte said. Thomas didn't ask. Clara's mouth pressed briefly. He's a lawyer. He understands contingency arrangements. He thought it seemed straightforward. And you? Clara was quiet for a moment. I thought the $60 was a long time ago, and a long way away. She looked at the water. But Thomas thought we should pursue it, and She stopped. I signed what he asked me to sign. And the witnesses, Charlotte said, friends of Thomas's from Colorado. They did hear Wyatt say things once about the property and our future. That part isn't fabricated. She paused. But it was a dinner party in 1873. It was a man talking about what he hoped for, not a legal commitment. Did you know that was how Holt was framing it? I knew by the time the filing was made, Clara said. Yes. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Charlotte recognized as a person telling the truth and finding it more uncomfortable than the alternative. I could have stopped it. I didn't. Why not? Charlotte said. Clara turned and looked at her directly the first time in the conversation she had made full eye contact. Because I wanted to see what he'd built, she said. Because I walked away from that ranch and I told myself it was the right decision. And I have told myself that every day for 4 years, and then someone told me it was doing well, now that there was a water contract and a loan being managed, and the property was recovering, and She stopped. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see what it could have been. The water ran over the stones. You could have just come, Charlotte said quietly. You didn't need a legal filing to come to Montana. Clara looked at her for a long moment. No, she said. I didn't. She turned back to the water. Your letter was the first honest thing that had happened in this whole business. Will you tell the truth at the hearing? Charlotte said. Yes, Clara said, without hesitation. I came here to tell the truth. That's why I came. She paused. Holt and Thomas are going to be angry. I know, Charlotte said. You knew I'd say yes when you wrote to me. I hoped you would, Charlotte said. I thought you were someone who would rather be honest than comfortable. I could have been wrong. Clara was quiet for a moment. The $60, she said. I'd like it back, not through the lawsuit, just I'd like it acknowledged. We'll put it in writing, Charlotte said. $60 at 3% interest from 1874, payable over 2 years. She met Clara's eyes. Garrett can draw it up tonight. Something in Clara's face changed something that had been held together carefully for the entirety of the conversation. Let go slightly, a kind of relief that a person shows when they have been waiting for something to be said plainly, and it finally is. All right, Clara said. Charlotte clicked the horses forward. Tell me about Denver, she said. The real version. And for the 20 minutes back to town, Clara talked and Charlotte listened, and neither of them said anything else about the property, or the hearing, or Wyatt, or the past. And by the time they pulled up outside Garrett's office, there was between them something that was not friendship, but was its honest predecessor. The particular understanding of two people who have seen each other clearly, and found that the truth, however complicated, is easier to stand in than the story someone else was telling about them. Cheque. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Clara testified for 12 of them. She said clearly, and without equivocation, that no explicit property co-ownership promise had been made, that the letter of March 1874 was personal correspondence between two engaged people, and not a legal instrument, that the two witnesses had heard one dinner conversation and were not present for any formal agreement, and that she had voluntarily terminated the engagement in 1875 of her own volition and without coercion. She said the $60 had been a personal loan between two people who had intended to marry, that it had not been offered as a property investment, and that she had agreed to a separate repayment arrangement that had been drawn up by Garrett the previous evening and signed by both parties. Holt objected 3 times. The judge overruled him twice and sustained him once on a technicality that didn't affect the outcome. The injunction was lifted at 11:47 in the morning. The easement registration was confirmed by the county clerk's office by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Garrett shook Charlotte's hand in the hallway outside the courtroom with the expression of a man who had won an argument he hadn't been entirely sure he was going to win. You knew she'd recant, he said. I knew she didn't want to be used, Charlotte said. Those aren't the same thing. He acknowledged this with the single small nod that was his version of concession. Coop, who had driven the wagon to town and spent the hearing outside on the bench because he said courtrooms gave him a rash, stood up when they came out and looked at their faces and said, "Well, we're done," Wyatt said. Coop looked at Charlotte. "Her doing?" "Mostly," Wyatt said. Coop said, and sat back down and looked at the sky with the expression of a man privately revising a number of opinions he had held for a significant portion of his adult life. Clara left on the afternoon stage. Charlotte walked her to it. They stood at the stage door, and Clara looked at Charlotte one more time with those sharp dark eyes that had been seeing things clearly all along, just making different decisions than Charlotte would have about what to do with what they saw. "He's a good man," Clara said. "I knew it when I left him. I knew it the whole time." "I know," Charlotte said. "Was that hard to hear?" "No," Charlotte said honestly. "It confirmed what I already believed." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You were right, by the way, in your letter, about knowing the difference between what you want and what someone else wants you to want." She paused. "I haven't always been good at that." "Neither have I," Charlotte said. "I'm getting better." The stage driver called the final boarding. Clara picked up her bag. "Take care of the ranch," she said. "We will," Charlotte said. Clara climbed in. The stage pulled away. Charlotte watched it go down the main street of Dust Creek and turn onto the eastern road and disappear into the afternoon heat, and she stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of something being genuinely completely finished. Then she turned around and walked back to where Wyatt was waiting with the wagon, and she climbed up and he looked at her with that steady, open expression, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing needed to be said. He clicked the horses forward. They were halfway home when Charlotte said, "I want to plant fruit trees." Wyatt glanced at her. "What?" "On the south side of the kitchen garden. There's good light there, and the soil is deep enough. Apple and pear, if we can get the stock before fall." She looked at the road ahead. "They take 3 years to produce. But if we're going to be here in 3 years..." "We're going to be here in 3 years," Wyatt said. "Then we should plant them now." He was quiet for a moment. "How many?" he said. 6 to start," Charlotte said. "We can add more once we know which varieties take best to this soil." He nodded slowly with the particular nod of a man accepting a proposition that is not really about fruit trees and knows it. "I'll ask Pearl who she orders from," he said. "She'll know," Charlotte said. "She always does." The broken D came over the rise, and Charlotte saw it the way she had started seeing it every time they came home. Not as what it had been or what it almost wasn't, but as what it was, the repaired fence running straight along the road, the kitchen garden in its neat productive rows, the barn with its sound roof, the house with its painted face and its good windows, catching the late afternoon light and holding it. Hers, not as a last resort, not as the only option remaining, not as a thing she had arrived at by surviving everything else, as the first thing she had ever chosen fully and completely with every part of herself, and had stayed and fought for and refused to let be taken, and would wake up tomorrow and choose again. Wyatt pulled the wagon up to the gate, and they both climbed down, and Coop appeared from the barn with his squinted expression and his steady, unhurried movement, and somewhere on the property. Pearl's voice carried from the direction of the kitchen garden. She had apparently let herself in again, which was a habit Charlotte had decided weeks ago was not going to be a problem, and the ordinary evening sounds of a working ranch came up around them like something solid. Wyatt came to stand beside her at the gate. Not behind her, not in front of her. Beside her the way he had been since the first morning she'd handed him 3 letters and told him to post them before the bank opened. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," she said back. He reached over and took her hand the way he had on the wagon the day they came back from Red Fork. Simple and deliberate, and without performance. And she held his, and they stood at the gate of the broken D and looked at what 2 months and 2 people and a great deal of refusal to give up had made. $2, she said. "Best $2 I ever spent," he said. Charlotte looked at the fruit tree she had not yet planted. At the fence post Pearl had shown her how to set. At the barn roof that had taken 3 days and all 3 of them working. At the garden that had started as a row of struggling plants and was now producing more than they could use, and at the kitchen, where Pearl's voice was saying something opinionated about the state of the supper preparations. She thought about a wooden platform in a room full of laughter. She thought about standing there with her hands pressed flat against her skirt and her eyes fixed on a point above the heads of a crowd that had decided in the first 30 seconds everything it was going to believe about her. She thought about a man in the back of the room who looked at the crowd instead of at her, and then looked at her, and then walked forward. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not rescued, not pitied, not accommodated. Chosen. By someone who had seen exactly what she was and decided it was the thing he wanted to walk toward. "Wyatt," she said. "I know what I want," she said. "From here, from all of it." He looked at her. "I want this," she said. "Exactly this. The work and the land and the fights we have to have and the problems we have to solve, and Pearl in our kitchen and Coop in our barn and the fruit trees we haven't planted yet." She looked at him. "And you, beside me, for all of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he raised her hand the way he had in Garrett's office when she'd said the word ours, the way he had on every significant day between then and now, and pressed it briefly to his jaw and closed his eyes, and she felt the steadiness of him, the deep, earned, unperformed steadiness of a man who has come through a long, hard time and is standing on the other side of it with his hand in someone else's. He opened his eyes. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Not a question. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And that was the truth. The whole truth, the kind that doesn't need elaborating or qualifying or protecting from the possibility that someone in a room somewhere might decide differently about what it was worth. Charlotte Bennett, who had stood on an auction platform in a room full of laughter, with her hands pressed flat and her chin up and her eyes fixed on something no one else in the room could see, yet had known something that day that the room did not. That the measure of the person is not what a crowd decides in the first 30 seconds. It is what that person builds in the long silence after the laughter stops. She had built something, and she was keeping